In the mid-1960s, the Cold War had settled into a tense and dangerous rhythm. On one side stood the United States and its allies, confident in their growing technological and economic power. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, projecting an image of strength but increasingly anxious about how far behind it was falling in key areas that would shape the future: computers, communications, precision electronics, and the subtle machinery of influence. Inside that Soviet system, far from the front pages and the headlines, were people whose job was to bridge worlds: interpreters, guides, cultural officers, people like Olga Formakovskaya. They stood between Soviet leaders and Western dignitaries, between KGB officers and their foreign targets, between two worlds that were locked in a struggle not just of weapons, but of information and perception. To understand why a Soviet interpreter working with the KGB might defect in 1966, you first have to understand the special role interpreters occupied in the Soviet system. In the West, an interpreter was often just that, a language professional specializing in communication. In the Soviet Union, especially at the level of high politics, interpreters and guides were something else entirely. They were eyes and ears for the state. When Western politicians visited Moscow, when trade delegations came to negotiate contracts, when cultural exchanges were arranged, interpreters were not simply there to translate words. They were there to observe. They were there to report. They were there to help the KGB construct psychological profiles of Western leaders, to identify vulnerabilities, and to assess who might someday be susceptible to influence. The Soviet state had a special institution, Intourist, formally a state tourism organization, but in practice a carefully crafted shell that housed KGB operations aimed at Western visitors. When Western diplomats, businessmen, scientists, or cultural figures came to the Soviet Union, Intourist handled their hotels, their itineraries, their guides, and, crucially, their interpreters. Those interpreters were screened, trained, and often directly controlled by the KGB. They knew what they could say and what they could not. They knew which topics were sensitive. They knew how to steer conversations. And they knew that after each day's work, they would be debriefed about what they had seen and heard. By the early 1960s, the Kremlin understood that the Cold War was no longer just about tank armies facing each other in Central Europe or nuclear warheads hidden in missile silos. It was about prestige. It was about who could send rockets into space, who could put satellites into orbit, who could build computers that could process information faster and more reliably. It was about whose system could attract allies, students, intellectuals. American cities glowed with neon and television screens. American corporations were building mainframe computers and semiconductor devices. American universities were training a generation of scientists and engineers whose work would shape the late 20th century. To many Soviet elites, the West, especially the United States, was terrifyingly advanced. They saw it when they traveled abroad. They saw it when they met Western delegations. They heard it indirectly, even in the very conversations they were tasked with interpreting. A visiting Western trade official might casually mention a computer system his company had just installed. A scientist might talk about a new data processing system in a laboratory. A diplomat might speak of satellite communications networks that were slowly beginning to appear. Interpreters like Olga stood between those Western voices and the Soviet leadership, faithfully rendering the words into Russian, but at the same time silently processing the meaning, feeling the gap. For the KGB, this tension between Soviet pride and Soviet inferiority was both a problem and an opportunity. On one hand, it fueled paranoia. If the Americans were that far ahead in computing and communications, what secret capabilities might they already possess? On the other hand, it provided justification for an enormous expansion of espionage. If the Soviet Union could not match the United States in open research and development, it would attempt to close the gap by stealing what it could not build. Industrial espionage became a central mission of the Soviet intelligence services. They were no longer focused only on military secrets, like missile designs or nuclear warhead specifications. They targeted microelectronics, communications infrastructure, encryption systems, and even management techniques. Interpreters were at the heart of this new type of espionage. Unlike case officers operating under deep cover, interpreters moved openly in diplomatic and semi-public spaces. They were present in negotiations, banquets, conferences, and private conversations between Soviet and Western officials. Their job was to make sure both sides understood each other, but the KGB quickly realized that interpreters could also record what Western dignitaries said, how they said it, what they seemed to care about, what they dismissed, and what they feared. If a Western politician repeatedly asked about Soviet missile capabilities, that was noted. If a Western trade minister kept returning to questions about access to Soviet oil or gas, that was catalogued. If a visiting scientist seemed especially interested in a particular Soviet research institute, that too was reported. For someone like Olga, this meant living a double life. Outwardly, she was a professional, skilled in languages, present in elegant reception halls, translating toasts and speeches, smoothing over misunderstandings, laughing politely at diplomatic jokes. Inwardly, she was constantly analyzing, remembering, cataloging, reporting. After each event, after each meeting, she would be called in by her KGB handler or by a political officer attached to the delegation. She would be asked to recount everything she had seen and heard. What did the Western dignitary really seem to think? What did he say when the conversation turned off the record? Did he drink too much? Did he make an indiscreet remark about a colleague? Did he hint at internal political rivalries back home? From the Western side, the presence of these interpreters and guides was tolerated but never fully trusted. Western security services understood that Intourist guides were likely KGB connected. They warned their delegations accordingly. But in order to function at all in the Soviet environment, Western diplomats and dignitaries had to make use of those services. You could not simply bring your own team and ignore the Soviet side. Every movement, every meeting, every conversation would run up against the Soviet system's demands for control. So Western visitors learned to speak carefully, to assume they were always being watched, to assume that their interpreter might be more than just a neutral professional.
Sometimes the KGB pushed beyond simply listening. In some operations, interpreters and Intourist staff were used to help set up compromising scenarios. A visiting politician could be invited to a private party. Alcohol would be abundant. Companionship would be arranged. Cameras might be hidden. If the visitor made a mistake, if he said something he should not, or did something he would not want publicized, the KGB would have material for blackmail. Interpreters might not be the ones operating the cameras, but they were part of the machinery. They translated the invitations, smoothed over the arrangements, and then quietly reported back on what transpired. By the mid-1960s, the Cold War had entered a new phase. The Cuban Missile Crisis had come and gone, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear Armageddon and then back. Soviet leaders had seen up close what American military and technological power could do. They had watched U.S. reconnaissance systems find and track their missiles in Cuba. They had watched the United States implement a naval quarantine and mobilize its forces with astonishing speed. They had come away chastened. At the same time, Soviet elites were increasingly exposed to Western consumer culture and technology. Jet travel, television, early computers, and communication systems showed them what their own system lacked. For the KGB, this increased contact was both dangerous and necessary. They needed information about Western plans and technologies. They needed access to Western firms and laboratories. They needed to know how Western leaders thought, how they might respond in a crisis. And interpreters were still one of the few human channels that operated openly between the two blocs. A Soviet engineer could not easily visit a Western electronics plant. A Soviet military planner could not just walk into a U.S. defense contractor's office. But a Soviet interpreter could stand at the side of a delegation visiting a Western plant, listening as company representatives explained their capabilities, quietly memorizing names, models, production capacities. Imagine, then, the psychological position of a Soviet interpreter who, by 1966, had spent years walking this narrow bridge between two worlds. On one side was the Soviet system, rigid, paranoid, often technologically behind, deeply suspicious of its own citizens, treating every foreign contact as a potential threat or a potential asset. On the other side was the Western world, messy, open, and often confusing, but undeniably vibrant and innovative. In Western capitals, interpreters saw office buildings filled with new machines, tabulators, tape-driven computers, advanced telephones. In Soviet ministries, they saw aging equipment, bureaucrats still relying on typewriters and paper files, and constant fear of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. For some interpreters, loyalty to the Soviet state overrode any doubts. They accepted the system as it was. They might even have believed that the West's technological superiority was only temporary, that socialism would eventually catch up and surpass it. But for others, those daily glimpses of Western technological and social dynamism sparked something more dangerous: curiosity. If the West could build those machines, what else had it built? If the West could tolerate criticism and debate, how could it be as fragile and decadent as Soviet propaganda insisted? If the West was really as weak and divided as Soviet leaders claimed, why did it seem to keep pulling ahead in one advanced field after another? Once those questions took root, the KGB's standard narrative began to crack. For an interpreter who had to sit in the middle of those two realities every day, it became harder and harder to maintain the fiction that the Soviet system was marching toward inevitable triumph. It became harder to ignore the possibility that the side presented as decadent might in fact be stronger because it allowed people to think and speak more freely, because it allowed scientists and engineers to compete and innovate without constant political interference. Defection is almost never a simple decision. For a Soviet interpreter tied to the KGB in 1966, it would have meant leaving behind not just a job, but family, friends, and a homeland. It meant accepting that the Soviet state would brand you a traitor. It meant knowing that your family could suffer reprisals. It meant stepping into a Western intelligence apparatus that would view you both as an asset and a potential deception. But for those who made that choice, like the interpreters and KGB-connected staff who crossed over during the 1960s, the decision was grounded in a combination of fear, disillusionment, and a growing respect for the power of an open, technologically advanced society. When a Soviet interpreter defected and agreed to tell Western intelligence services what she knew, the value was not just in the specific facts she carried: names of KGB officers, details of particular operations, contact points, tradecraft. Those things were valuable and were carefully recorded, but in many cases, the real value lay in her description of how the Soviet state saw the world. She could explain exactly how the KGB used interpreters and guides in operations against Western dignitaries. She could describe the standard procedures for debriefing after high-level meetings. She could explain how evaluation reports were written, who read them, and how conclusions were drawn about the reliability, vulnerability, or influence potential of Western politicians. She could also provide something more subtle, a sense of how Soviet elites reacted when confronted with Western technological superiority. She could recount moments when a Soviet official, standing in a Western communications center or computer room, turned to his colleagues and muttered, half in awe and half in fear, that the Americans were far ahead. She could describe how that recognition produced not a desire to reform and improve at home, but a conviction that espionage had to be intensified. If you cannot match the other side's research budget, you tell yourself, you will steal their results. Western intelligence officers listening to such a defector would quickly realize that the KGB's operations against dignitaries and politicians were not random. They were systematic efforts to close strategic gaps. If a Western minister controlled access to advanced electronics exports, that minister would be watched closely, his staff studied, his personal vulnerabilities mapped. If a Western politician was known to be skeptical of NATO or critical of defense spending, he would be profiled as a potential influence target. Interpreters would be instructed to pay special attention to his offhand remarks, to his jokes, to his body language.
The United States, with its tradition of open technological development and free press, often struggled to understand just how much weight the Soviet system placed on personal networks and human intelligence. To American policymakers, it was normal for a senator to criticize his own government, for a journalist to expose military weaknesses, for an engineer to publish details about a new technology. In the Soviet system, such openness was unthinkable. Criticizing the state could mean prison. Publishing technical information without permission could mean treason. So, when Soviet officers encountered the West, they filtered what they saw through the logic of their own system. They assumed that any public statement had been carefully orchestrated, that any openness was a trick, that hidden forces must be at work. Defectors who had served as interpreters were able to show Western analysts how deep this misunderstanding went. They could explain that when a Soviet general watched American news footage of a new computer system, he did not see a commercial or an informational piece. He saw a potential military threat. They could describe how KGB political officers would quote Western criticism of U.S. policy as proof that America was internally weak, even as they marveled at how such criticism could be voiced without fear. They could make clear that the Soviet leadership, in many ways, both envied and feared American technological power. For American audiences today, used to thinking of the Cold War in terms of nuclear missiles and spy satellites, it can be easy to forget just how impactful these human stories were. The defection of an interpreter, a translator, a mid-level KGB-connected cultural officer might not make front-page news in the way a high-ranking spy's defection would. But inside the classified world, those stories helped shape the Western understanding of the Soviet opponent. They provided texture, nuance, and confirmation that the East-West divide was not just about different flags over government buildings. It was about different ways of organizing knowledge, different assumptions about truth and secrecy, different relationships between technology and power. If you look back at the arc of the Cold War, one theme becomes clear. The Soviet Union never found a way to reconcile its desire for control with the demands of advanced technology. Modern computing, telecommunications, and information systems thrive in open environments. They need free experimentation, rapid iteration, and the circulation of ideas. In the United States, those conditions existed, sometimes chaotically, across universities, private companies, and government labs. In the Soviet Union, information was tightly controlled, research was subordinated to political directives, and failure could be a crime. Interpreters like Olga Farmakovskaya had a front-row seat to this contrast. They watched as Western companies rolled out new generations of machines almost every year, while Soviet institutions struggled to mass-produce even one reliable mainframe model. They translated conversations in which Soviet officials pressed Western executives for access to advanced systems, only to be rebuffed because export controls and security concerns prevented it.
They carried back to Moscow stories of Western computing centers humming with activity, and they saw the guilt and resentment in the eyes of their superiors who knew that their own country was lagging behind. When one of those interpreters finally decided to defect, that decision embodied a simple recognition: the system they were serving could not win the future by controlling information. It might be able to intimidate dissidents, suppress inconvenient truths, or fabricate statistics. It might be able to use the KGB to recruit agents, to steal trade secrets, to plant microphones and cameras. But it could not replicate the creative energy unleashed by a society that allowed its citizens to invent, criticize, and compete. For an American viewer watching this story today, there is a clear emotional through line. You can feel the tension of those Cold War years when Soviet and American delegations eyed each other across negotiating tables, with interpreters in the middle. You can sense the pride of a country that, for all its flaws and conflicts, built a technological ecosystem so compelling that even its rivals' own people could see its power. And you can understand why those defectors, people like Olga, whose names appear only briefly in declassified files, chose to cross the line. Their stories remind us that the Cold War was not won only by missiles and tanks. It was also won in conference rooms, research labs, trade fairs, and quiet offices where interpreters whispered their truths to Western debriefers. It was won because the side that trusted its people with information, that allowed its scientists to publish their results, that permitted open criticism and debate, turned out to be more resilient and more innovative than the side that tried to lock everything behind classified doors. In the end, the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its contradictions. It could not keep pace with Western technological development, even as it spied on it relentlessly. It could not maintain absolute control over information in a world increasingly wired together by communication systems it did not invent. And it could not replicate the creative energy unleashed by a society that allowed its citizens to invent, criticize, and compete. For an American viewer watching this story today, there is a clear emotional through line. You can feel the tension of those Cold War years when Soviet and American delegations eyed each other across negotiating tables, with interpreters in the middle. You can sense the pride of a country that, for all its flaws and conflicts, built a technological ecosystem so compelling that even its rivals' own people could see its power. And you can understand why those defectors, people like Olga, whose names appear only briefly in declassified files, chose to cross the line. Their stories remind us that the Cold War was not won only by missiles and tanks. It was also won in conference rooms, research labs, trade fairs, and quiet offices where interpreters whispered their truths to Western debriefers. It was won because the side that trusted its people with information, that allowed its scientists to publish their results, that permitted open criticism and debate, turned out to be more resilient and more innovative than the side that tried to lock everything behind classified doors. In the end, the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its contradictions. It could not keep pace with Western technological development, even as it spied on it relentlessly. It could not maintain absolute control over information in a world increasingly wired together by communication systems it did not invent. And it could not replicate the creative energy unleashed by a society that allowed its citizens to invent, criticize, and compete.